G'day everyone, thanks for joining me again. I hope you're all doing really well and most importantly, keeping safe. In this episode, we're going to talk about compression and more specifically, try to give you a method in which you can try to train yourself to hear compression. So let's get into it. So here we are back in Reaper. I have a track in front of me by a band called Squashed Lizard, and the track is called Not the Place to Be. I featured this track in a couple of my previous videos, one of which being how to build a static mix, and another video learning my personal favorite method on how to EQ elements within a track. So today we're going to talk about compression, and more specifically, trying to train your ears into learning what compression sounds like. So here I have in front of me just the stock standard Reaper compressor that comes with Reaper. And the technique I'm going to go through with you in this video should pretty well translate across any standard compressor that comes with your DAW. So I'm quickly just going to overview some of the parameters in a compressor, just for those of you that might be super brand new to this and you're not really sure what we're talking about. So the key main elements in a compressor are the ones that I'll explain now. The first one is the threshold. The threshold is basically the level that the signal needs to reach before the compressor will act. So sometimes it's referred to as a ceiling. So if we set our threshold to a certain value, when our signal hits that value, the compressor will start to respond. The compressor responds based primarily on the attack time, the release time, and the ratio. So the attack time is basically how long a signal will take to reach full compression once the signal has hit the threshold. So the signal goes up, it hits threshold, and the attack time determines how long the signal takes to reach full compression, determined by our ratio, which we'll go over in a minute. Once our signal comes below the threshold, then our release time tells the compressor how long it's going to take for that signal to recover to not being compressed at all. And our ratio determines how much compression there is. So as an example, if we dialed in a compression of, let's say 2:1 or thereabouts, if a signal went 2 dB over the threshold, it would be brought down to 1 dB above the threshold. So it's just a simple ratio of how it's going to work. Right, let's move into this little method that we've got to try to train our ears to hear compression. So the very first thing we're going to do is set very extreme settings on the compressor, and it's going to sound quite terrible. It's going to sound distorted, but that's okay for now because we're going to slowly massage the settings a little bit and you'll start to really hear what the compressor is actually doing. So the first thing we're going to do is move our attack and our release time to the fastest that they'll go, and we'll put our ratio to the highest it will go. What I've got is the top snare mic soloed out on this track. We're just going to work on the snare track for now. And I'm going to hit play. And then what I'll do is I'll bring this threshold down so that the signal starts to get affected by the compressor. So let's get into that. So we can definitely hear that the sound of that snare drum changed dramatically as I brought the threshold right down to once again a pretty extreme value. We were getting a lot of gain reduction, as you could tell by this meter here. So nearly 20 dB of gain reduction, and you can hear the sound is starting to get a bit distorted. So here's where the magic happens a little bit when you're starting to learn how to hear how compression sounds like. What I'm going to do is start with the attack time. So what you'll notice is as I move this attack time so that it becomes a slower attack time, it'll let that transient through a little bit more. And just have a listen to how that sounds like. So right about there, you start to hear that initial hit has a little bit more weight to it now. Now there is still a little bit of distortion there because our release time is so fast. So what I'll do is I'll hit play again. We'll leave the attack time there. I'll bring the release time up a little bit. And then I'll go back to sort of playing around with the attack time a little bit. And all I'm doing is I'm just going to go backwards and forwards, playing around with the attack and the release time, just so you can hear the different tonalities that the compressor can have on a signal, such as a snare mic. So massive change right there just by simply bringing the release time up. And if I make the attack time faster again, you can hear that it becomes very snappy. It's grabbing onto that transient really quickly. And if I slow down the attack time again, then more of that initial transient is getting through and then it clamps down afterwards. Let's play around with the release settings a little bit. Can you almost hear that the snare rattles underneath, even though this isn't a bottom snare mic? It's just the top snare mic, but the rattles or the snares underneath, they've almost disappeared. And if I make that release time faster again, all of a sudden we've got all that rattle snare sound of the bottom snares. So let's bypass this compression setting now and sort of hear the sound unaffected and then affected with the sound that we've got here. So, two things you should notice. First thing, obviously, with the compressor on, the sound got substantially quieter, which is to be expected. It's a compressor. What it's doing is it's attenuating volume. This is where the makeup gain comes in handy, so we can actually bring the volume up again. And what you'll notice when we do eventually do that is the quieter signals that are sort of in the background, like the bleed, things like the hi-hat ticking away, they'll actually get louder as I bring this makeup gain up. So what you can sort of think of what's happening at the moment is we've started off with sort of our peak level of our snare here and our sort of background or bleed noise down here. What we're doing is we're quietening down the peak of that snare, which is bringing it closer to this background noise. The overall level is actually going to be quieter and we need to move everything up. So therefore the bleed sound or that background noise is actually going to get a bit louder in our mix. The other thing you'll notice between the A and B is that with the compressor activated, the snare now has this kind of weight and punch to it that it didn't quite have before. So let's have a listen to that again. Got a lot more snap now, and bearing in mind we are still dealing with quite extreme settings here. This is just to get your ears dialed in to sort of listen to how the compression sounds. So let's tweak our ratio to something a little bit more acceptable, probably somewhere around the 4:1 mark is where I'd usually start. And basically, depending on what element I'm compressing and what the purpose of the compressor is for me, I'm probably going to start with trying to get maybe around about 10 dB of gain reduction and then sort of back it off a little bit and just sort of see and listen to how that compressor is actually affecting the sound and just try and find a balance where I think it's giving enough compression, giving a nice little tone to the snare that I want. So there, it's barely being affected. It's affecting about maybe 7 dB of gain reduction there. It's tightened everything up nicely. That's probably a bit much. Although to be fair, there's something in the punch and the snap of that I like. but it's probably a bit extreme. So I might just back it off a little bit. And now if I A-B between bypassing the compressor, I much prefer the sound of that. It is quieter, so let's bump up this makeup gain a little bit. Now, when I A-B between having the compressor active and not active, I'm trying to volume match or level match between it being bypassed and not bypassed. Once again, as I explained in a previous video, I'm trying to not have my ears be fooled by loudness. So generally our ears will think that anything that's louder is better. That's just how we hear. If we can balance that volume out, then we can sort of make a pretty good assessment as to whether what we're doing is actually good or not so good. Okay, that seems pretty well volume matched there. So I'm going to give you one more A-B with this setting. What I want you to pay particular attention to are two things. How the overall tone of the snare has changed now. In my opinion, it's got a little bit more punch and a little bit more weight to it. But the other thing I want you to pay attention to is this background noise and bleed. Things like cymbal hits, hi-hat ticking away. Just have a listen to the difference in level, and all because we've basically compressed the whole signal of the snare and then brought everything up. So we'll start with it in bypassed mode. So the snare sounds quite rattly, a little bit thin. And you can hear the hi-hat ticking away, but it's not too bad. Now let's activate the compressor. All of a sudden that hi-hat is right in there. Background cymbals are coming in, but the snare itself sounds nice and tight. It's got a bit more punch to it now. Okay, so that's basically just a quick overview of this method of starting with extreme settings and then slowly dialing in bits and pieces, namely starting with the attack and then the release, and just really listening to how that's changing the overall sound of whatever it is that you're actually trying to compress. The last little quick example I'm going to give you now, I'm going to bypass the EQ and the compressor all at once and then bring them back in, just so you can simply hear the effect of one EQ instance and one compressor instance pretty much per track. So I'll start with everything bypassed.
I'm losing my way, I'm getting led astray by someone who doesn't know my name. I need to get where I'm going and where I am going. I need to get there today, so the place I am going requires you to not know where you're going until you get where.
And so there you go. Pretty dramatic effect, and all I've used is one EQ instance, one compressor instance on most of the tracks, and all of a sudden it's starting to sound like a completely different song. It's just really coming alive. So there you have it. I hope you found the information in this video useful, and I hope it's something that you can use to help develop your ear in being able to hear what compression sounds like. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Until next time, I'll see you on the next one.